Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we explore the ways many Native American cultures understood the natural world, not as something separate from human life, but as something living, something connected, a world filled with relationship, movement, cycles, and meaning. Across North America, hundreds of nations developed across forests, plains, deserts, mountains, rivers, and coastlines, each with distinct languages, traditions, stories, and systems of knowledge. And because these cultures developed in very different environments, their understandings of nature also differed. The beliefs of peoples living in the Arctic North were not identical to those living in the Southwest deserts or the eastern woodlands or the Great Plains. And yet, across many of these traditions, certain patterns appear repeatedly. A recognition that humans were not separate from nature, but part of it, one life among many forms of life, not above the world, but within it. This idea shaped how land was understood, how animals were viewed, how resources were used, and how balance was maintained. In many traditions, the earth itself was understood as alive, not merely as ground or territory, but as something sustaining, something deserving of respect, a provider rather than an object to dominate. This relationship was often expressed through language, through stories, and through ritual practices. Many communities viewed hunting not simply as extraction, but as participation within a larger system. Animals were often understood as beings with agency, intelligence, and spirit. In some traditions, hunters offered prayers before or after a hunt, acknowledging the life that had been taken and recognizing dependence on the natural world. This reflects an important idea that survival itself created responsibility, not ownership. The relationship between humans and animals was not always viewed as a strict separation. Many oral traditions describe animals speaking, teaching, or acting as guides, not necessarily as literal events, but as ways of expressing that wisdom could be observed throughout the natural world. The behavior of animals often carried meaning, migration patterns, seasonal movement, changes in sound, or shifts in behavior. could signal environmental change, weather patterns, or the movement of resources. Careful observation of nature was essential, not only spiritually, but practically, because survival depended on understanding the rhythms of the environment. When plants emerged, when rivers changed, when herds moved, when winter approached, knowledge of these cycles was passed across generations through oral teaching, through repeated experience, and through storytelling. Stories held many functions. They preserved memory, explained relationships, and carried knowledge forward without written systems. Some stories explained how particular animals gained their traits, how landscapes were formed, or how humans learned specific practices. These stories often contained layers of meaning: practical, moral, and symbolic at the same time. In many traditions, nature was not viewed as silent. The wind, the rivers, thunder, the stars, and fire could all carry significance. Natural events were often understood not as random, but as part of a living system, one that humans participated in, but did not control. This produced a different relationship to uncertainty. Storms, droughts, floods, and harsh winters could not be prevented, but they could be respected, observed, and prepared for. Many Native American cultures developed systems of life that followed seasonal movement. Communities adapted to the environment rather than attempting to completely reshape it. In the plains regions, for example, the movement of buffalo herds influenced travel, food systems, clothing, and shelter. Nearly every part of the animal could be used for tools, containers, warmth, or food. This reduced waste, not only from necessity, but because resources were understood as valuable and limited. In desert regions, water became central. Communities developed deep knowledge of rainfall, dry cycles, and methods of survival within difficult conditions. In forest regions, trees provided materials for shelter, transportation, medicine, and fuel. Different environments produced different systems of knowledge, but all required careful observation of the natural world. There was also a strong awareness of interdependence, that no form of life existed alone. Plants, animals, humans, weather, water, and land were connected within larger cycles. Taking too much could disrupt balance. Ignoring patterns could create hardship, and survival often depended not on conquering nature, but on understanding it. This understanding was reinforced through ceremony, songs, seasonal gatherings, and rituals tied to cycles of planting, harvest, migration, or celestial events. The sky itself held deep significance. The moon, the movement of stars, and the changing position of the sun helped structure time, track seasons, and guide travel. In some traditions, the Milky Way was understood through stories of journeys, spirits, or pathways across the sky. Again, these interpretations varied widely, but the night sky was rarely viewed as empty. It was part of the same living system that surrounded daily life. There was also an understanding that knowledge required patience, observation over long periods, awareness of repetition, and attention to subtle change. A person learned the land not quickly, but gradually, across seasons, across years, by returning to the same rivers, the same forests, the same skies again and again. And over time, patterns became visible, the first signs of spring, the sounds carried by wind, the changing behavior of birds, the movement of clouds before storms. Nature became something read carefully, not controlled completely. And this relationship between humans and the natural world would shape not only survival, but philosophy, identity, and spiritual understanding across generations. And as these ideas continued to develop, different nations formed distinct ways of describing humanity's place within the larger world, ways that connected land, spirit, memory, and the cycles of life itself. And so, as generations continued to observe the natural world, a deeper understanding developed, not only about survival, but about relationship. Because in many Native American traditions, the land was not viewed as passive space, not merely as property or territory defined by ownership, but as something active, something that shaped identity, memory, responsibility, and continuity. A river was not only water. A mountain was not only stone. A forest was not only a collection of trees. Places carried meaning because they were connected to stories, to ancestors, to migration, to ceremony, and to repeated human experience across generations. This created a form of geographic memory in which knowledge of the land contained practical information, but also cultural meaning. Certain locations might be associated with origin stories, seasonal gatherings, historical events, or spiritual significance. And these meanings were preserved not primarily through writing, but through oral tradition, through repetition, and through continued relationship with the place itself. To know the land was not only to recognize its appearance, but to understand its patterns, its dangers, its cycles, its resources, and its stories. In many traditions, this relationship with land was closely tied to the concept of spirit. Though the meaning of spirit varied significantly between nations, some traditions understood that spiritual presence existed throughout the natural world, in animals, plants, rivers, weather, and landscapes, not necessarily as separate beings, but as forms of living presence within a connected system. This perspective is sometimes described by anthropologists as animistic, though the word itself can oversimplify complex traditions, because it suggests a single belief system where many distinct systems existed. Still, across many cultures, there appears a recurring idea that life is not limited to humans alone, and that humans participate within a broader living structure rather than standing apart from it. This perspective influenced behavior because if the natural world possesses meaning, relationship, or spirit, then interaction with it requires care. In many communities, specific practices developed around harvesting plants, fishing, hunting, or gathering resources, often involving gratitude, offerings, or restraint. Some groups practiced seasonal harvesting patterns that prevented depletion. Others rotated hunting areas, allowed certain regions to recover, or avoided taking more than necessary. Not because resources were infinite, but because imbalance carried consequences. This awareness developed partly through experience. Communities living closely with the environment could observe that overhunting reduced populations, that damaged soil reduced growth, that disrupted patterns affected survival. Over long periods of time, this produced systems of environmental knowledge built through direct observation across generations. Different nations developed expertise specific to their environments. In Arctic regions, communities developed detailed understanding of ice conditions, animal migration, wind patterns, and seasonal light changes. In desert regions, knowledge focused on water sources, heat cycles, drought conditions, and drought-resistant plants. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, fishing systems developed around salmon migration with knowledge of river timing, ocean conditions, and preservation techniques in eastern woodland regions. Communities developed agricultural systems that combined crops strategically: corn, beans, and squash, sometimes referred to collectively as the Three Sisters, because these plants supported one another when grown together. Corn provided structure for climbing beans. Beans helped replenish nitrogen in the soil, and squash leaves reduced moisture loss and limited weeds. This reflects another recurring principle, that observation of natural systems could guide human systems. Nature itself was often treated as a teacher. Patterns found in ecosystems could reveal ways to organize life. Sustainability, cooperation, adaptation, and timing. There was also widespread attention to cycles, the movement of seasons, the timing of migrations, the return of plants, the behavior of birds, and changes in weather helped structure time, rather than separating human life from natural rhythms. Daily and seasonal life often moved with them. Food storage, travel, ceremony, and shelter were adjusted according to changing conditions. This required flexibility because environments changed constantly. Drought, flooding, harsh winters, and scarcity could alter entire ways of life. Adaptation became essential, and knowledge of the environment could determine survival. This also shaped attitudes towards certainty, because nature itself was understood as dynamic, changing, sometimes predictable, and sometimes unpredictable. Storms could arrive suddenly. Rivers could shift course. Fires could transform landscapes, and animal populations could rise or disappear across seasons. The world was not assumed to remain stable indefinitely. Instead, life required awareness, adjustment, and respect for forces larger than oneself. In many traditions, this understanding was reinforced through ceremony. Ceremonies often aligned with seasonal transitions, solstices, harvest periods, migration cycles, or celestial events. These gatherings were not only spiritual, they also reinforced collective memory, transferred knowledge, strengthened relationships, and maintained continuity across generations. Music, dance, storytelling, and symbolic dress could all become part of these practices, not merely as performance, but as participation within a shared system. There was also a strong emphasis on listening, not only speaking, listening to elders, to stories, to weather, to animals, and to subtle environmental change. Knowledge was often earned slowly through experience, observation, and patience, rather than immediate instruction alone. A person might spend years learning how to identify weather shifts from cloud formation, how to track animals from disturbed vegetation, or how to navigate using stars, landmarks, and memory. This produced systems of intelligence deeply tied to environment. Knowledge was not separated from the world around it. It emerged from direct interaction with it. And because oral tradition was central, memory became extremely important. Stories were repeated carefully across generations, preserving practical information, historical events, moral lessons, and spiritual ideas at the same time. The repetition itself helped maintain continuity, allowing knowledge to survive across long periods without written systems. And through all of these patterns, a broader worldview emerges, one in which humans are not isolated, not disconnected observers, but participants within a living environment, an environment that provides, sustains, challenges, and teaches. And as these relationships deepened, different nations developed their own ways of describing humanity's place within this larger system through creation stories, animal teachings, sky traditions, and explanations about how balance should be maintained. And so, as different nations developed their own relationships with the land, they also developed their own ways of explaining how the world began, how humans arrived within it, and how balance was meant to be maintained. These explanations were preserved primarily through oral tradition, through stories spoken aloud across generations, often repeated around fires, during ceremonies, or during periods of seasonal gathering. And because these traditions were carried orally, they remained flexible, capable of adaptation, while still preserving core ideas. There was not one single Native American creation story, but many. Different nations described different origins, different landscapes, different beings, and different relationships between humans and the natural world. Some traditions describe emergence from underground worlds, where earlier forms of existence existed before the present one. Others describe creation through water, through sky beings, through animals, or through acts of cooperation between different forces. Among several nations of the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes regions, there are stories sometimes referred to as earth diver stories. In these stories, the world begins covered in water, with no dry land visible. An animal then dives beneath the surface, attempting to retrieve soil or mud from below, which is then used to form the earth. Different nations describe different animals performing this act, such as muskrats, turtles, or other beings. The details vary widely, but the pattern itself appears repeatedly. The earth is not created instantly through domination, but gradually through cooperation, effort, and participation within a larger system. In some traditions, the earth itself is formed upon the back of a turtle, leading to the phrase, Turtle Island, which remains significant among many Indigenous peoples today. This image carries multiple layers of meaning. The turtle represents endurance, stability, and support, and the world itself is imagined not as fixed and mechanical, but as something living, supported within a larger structure. In many traditions, animals appear not only as physical beings, but as teachers, messengers, or examples of particular qualities. Certain animals became associated with observation, patience, strength, adaptability, or intelligence. The eagle, for example, is often associated with height, vision, and connection between earth and sky, because it moves at great distances above the land. It becomes linked symbolically with perspective, clarity, and awareness. The bear often appears as a figure connected with strength, protection, and survival. Its seasonal hibernation also linked it symbolically with cycles of withdrawal and return. The wolf, in some traditions, represented cooperation, strategy, and social structure. Observations of wolf behavior, their communication, their coordinated movement, and their care for the group could become models for understanding human relationships. The coyote appears in many traditions as a trickster figure, a being associated with unpredictability, disruption, and the consequences of poor judgment. These stories often contain humor, contradiction, or unexpected outcomes. But beneath them are observations about human behavior, ego, impulsiveness, and imbalance. The trickster figure is important because it reflects a recognition that intelligence alone does not guarantee wisdom, and that disorder, mistakes, and unpredictability are also part of life. Many of these stories functioned simultaneously as entertainment, education, and philosophical reflection. Children could hear them as stories, while adults recognized deeper layers of meaning developed through experience. This layered storytelling allowed knowledge to remain accessible across generations. There was also widespread emphasis on balance, not balance as perfect stillness, but balance as ongoing adjustment, a condition that required awareness and maintenance rather than permanent control. This idea appears repeatedly in relationships with land, with community, with animals, and with personal behavior, taking too much. Acting without restraint or ignoring responsibility could create imbalance, and imbalance often carried consequences, not only for individuals, but for the larger group. This understanding shaped decision-making, resource use, and social expectations. In many communities, cooperation became essential for survival. Food gathering, construction, travel, childcare, and defense often depended on collective participation. This reinforced the idea that individuals existed within networks of responsibility, rather than complete independence. Elders also held an important role in many traditions, not simply because of age, but because long experience allowed patterns to become visible over time. Knowledge accumulated gradually through seasons, through observation, through memory, and through repeated interaction with the environment. An elder who had observed weather patterns for decades, animal migrations over many years, or changes in the landscape across time, held forms of knowledge that could not be gained quickly. This created respect for patience, for listening, and for continuity between generations. There was also recognition that humans themselves were capable of disrupting balance, greed, carelessness, conflict, or disrespect toward the environment could produce consequences extending beyond immediate circumstances. Many stories warn against arrogance, against assuming complete control over nature, or forgetting dependence on the systems that sustain life. This differs significantly from worldviews that position humans entirely outside or above the natural world. In many Native American traditions, humans remain participants within larger systems, not masters standing beyond them. The seasons themselves reinforce this understanding. Winter could bring scarcity, spring renewal, summer growth, autumn preparation. Each season required different forms of behavior, different knowledge, and different priorities. Life moved with cycles rather than against them, and because these cycles repeated continuously, time itself was often experienced through return, through recurrence, through patterns observed again and again across generations. This produced a worldview deeply connected to observation, relationship, and continuity. A worldview in which the natural world was not empty background, but active presence, teacher, provider, and source of meaning. And as these understandings expanded, many nations also developed highly detailed systems connected to the sky, to celestial movement, and to the patterns visible above the earth each night. And so, as the natural world was observed closely across seasons and generations, attention also turned upward toward the sky itself, because for many Native American cultures, the sky was not empty space, and the stars were not distant objects without meaning. They were part of the same living world that surrounded daily life, part of the same patterns that shaped movement, time, migration, and memory. Long before mechanical clocks, calendars, or modern navigation systems, the sky provided structure. The movement of the sun helped track seasons. The moon shaped cycles of time, and the stars became guides for travel, storytelling, ceremony, and observation. Different nations developed different interpretations of the night sky, depending on geography, climate, and cultural tradition. But across many regions, careful observation of celestial movement became deeply important. The changing position of the sunrise throughout the year could signal seasonal transition. The appearance of particular stars might indicate migration periods, planting times, or environmental change. This required long-term observation because patterns in the sky move slowly, gradually, and repeatedly across generations. To recognize them, a person needed patience, memory, and attention to detail. In many traditions, the moon held particular significance. Rather than dividing time strictly into numbered months, some communities named moon cycles according to environmental changes occurring during that period. For example, certain moons might correspond to freezing rivers, falling leaves, returning salmon, planting seasons, or animal migration. This linked time directly to the environment itself. Time was not separated from nature. It was observed through nature. A season was understood not only through dates, but through visible changes in plants, animals, temperature, light, and sky conditions. There was also close attention to the Milky Way. Across many cultures around the world, the Milky Way has inspired stories, and Native American traditions were no exception. Different nations interpreted this band of light in different ways. Some saw it as a path traveled by spirits. Others associated it with migration routes, journeys after death, or celestial movement across worlds. Again, there was no single shared interpretation, but the recurring pattern is significant. The sky was understood relationally, through story, through meaning, and through connection to human experience. Constellations also carried different meanings depending on region. Some nations identified patterns linked to animals, hunters, or cultural figures. Others connected celestial movement to practical environmental timing. The rising of certain stars before dawn, for example, could signal changing seasons or preparation for migration. This created systems of astronomical knowledge built through repeated observation over long periods of time. In the American Southwest, some cultures constructed buildings aligned with solar movement. allowing sunlight to interact with structures in precise ways during solstices or seasonal transitions. At places such as Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and other ancient sites, researchers have identified evidence suggesting careful observation of solar and lunar cycles. Certain windows, doorways, or stone markers appear intentionally aligned with celestial events. This indicates not only spiritual interest in the sky, but systematic observation. The sky became both symbolic and practical at the same time. There was also awareness of unpredictability in celestial events. Eclipses, comets, meteor showers, and unusual atmospheric conditions could carry significance because they disrupted ordinary patterns. Human beings naturally notice interruption, especially when stable systems suddenly change. And because the sky appeared consistent night after night, rare events often carried powerful meaning. The relationship between sky and land also remained closely connected. The movement of stars could guide travel across large distances, particularly in open plains, deserts, or coastal environments where landmarks were limited. Knowledge of direction, seasonal position, and celestial movement became essential for navigation. This required a different kind of intelligence than modern GPS systems. Navigation depended on memory, observation, environmental awareness, and familiarity with recurring patterns. There was also an understanding that humans existed within larger cycles extending beyond immediate daily life. The sky reinforced scale, the regular movement of stars, the return of seasons, and the repetition of celestial patterns created awareness that human life itself was temporary within much larger systems. And yet, those larger systems remained connected to daily existence. A change in season affected food, migration, shelter, travel, and survival. Large cosmic patterns and immediate human life were not experienced as separate worlds. They interacted constantly. This perspective encouraged attentiveness, because survival often depended on noticing gradual change before it became immediate danger. A shift in wind patterns, changes in bird movement, different cloud formations, or unusual temperatures could all signal transition. Observation became a form of preparation, and over time, communities developed sophisticated environmental awareness through repeated interaction with these patterns. This also reinforced humility, because the sky could not be controlled. The seasons could not be forced, and nature itself did not operate according to human preference. Storms arrived when they arrived. Winters lasted as long as they lasted, and drought could reshape entire regions for years. Human beings remain dependent on systems larger than themselves. This understanding appears repeatedly across many traditions. That life requires participation within larger patterns, rather than complete control over them. And through continued observation of the sky, the land, the seasons, and animal behavior, many Native American cultures developed ways of understanding the world that emphasized relationship, adaptation, memory, and continuity across generations. And as these systems continue to evolve, they also shaped ideas about community, responsibility, leadership, and the ways human beings were expected to live with one another. And so, as observation of the land and sky-shaped daily life, these understandings also influenced how communities were organized, how decisions were made, and how responsibility was understood within the group. Because survival often depended not on isolated individuals, but on cooperation. In many Native American societies, life required coordinated effort across families and generations. Food gathering, hunting, construction, travel, childcare, protection, and preparation for winter often depended on collective participation. This encouraged systems that emphasized relationship and responsibility rather than extreme individual independence. The well-being of the group affected the well-being of the individual, and the actions of individuals could affect the stability of the entire community. Different nations organize themselves in different ways. Some developed highly decentralized structures, while others formed large confederacies involving multiple nations working together. Among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes referred to as the Iroquois Confederacy, multiple nations formed systems of alliance designed to reduce internal conflict and maintain stability across large regions. These systems involved councils, discussion, negotiation, and shared decision-making processes. Leadership in many communities was not always based solely on force or inheritance. Qualities such as wisdom, generosity, experience, courage, and the ability to maintain trust could become important factors in leadership roles. A leader who acted recklessly, ignored the needs of the group, or failed to maintain balance could lose influence over time. This reflects another recurring principle, that authority carried responsibility, not simply power. In many traditions, elders held important roles because memory itself was valuable. An elder might remember previous droughts, harsh winters, migration changes, conflicts, or successful survival strategies from decades earlier. That accumulated knowledge became essential for long-term stability. There was also strong emphasis in many communities on teaching younger generations gradually through participation. Children often learned by observing adults directly, watching repeated tasks, joining daily work, and listening to stories that contained practical and moral instruction at the same time. Learning was often integrated into life itself, rather than separated entirely into formal institutions. A child might learn navigation by traveling, weather patterns by observing storms, plant knowledge by gathering alongside experienced relatives, or animal behavior through repeated exposure over many years. This produced forms of education deeply connected to environment and lived experience. There was also recognition that different people developed different skills. Some became hunters, trackers, storytellers, healers, craft specialists, negotiators, or spiritual leaders. Knowledge itself often became highly specialized. Certain individuals might spend decades studying medicinal plants, learning which roots reduced pain, which leaves helped wounds heal, or which combinations became dangerous. This medical knowledge developed through long-term experimentation and observation. In forest regions alone, hundreds of plant species could carry specific uses connected to healing, nutrition, dyes, construction, or ceremony. Some medicines, later studied scientifically, were already being used by indigenous communities long before European arrival. For example, certain willow bark preparations contained compounds related to what would eventually become aspirin. This reflects another important pattern: careful observation of the environment often produced practical systems of knowledge developed over centuries. There was also awareness that knowledge required ethical use. A skilled hunter who took excessively, or a leader who acted selfishly, could disrupt balance within the group. This concern with balance appears repeatedly across different regions and traditions. Balance between individual needs and collective responsibility, between use and restraint, between courage and caution, between action and patience. The environment itself reinforced these lessons constantly. A difficult winter could remind communities how quickly conditions could change. Scarcity could reveal the importance of cooperation, and abundance could not always be assumed to last indefinitely. This produced cultures that often valued preparation, adaptability, and awareness of long-term consequences. There was also strong emphasis in many traditions on generosity and reciprocity. Sharing food, resources, or labor helped strengthen relationships within the group. Because in environments where survival could become difficult quickly, maintaining strong social bonds increased collective resilience. A person isolated entirely from the community often faced greater risk than one connected to systems of mutual support. Many ceremonies reinforce these relationships. Gatherings could involve gift exchange, shared meals, storytelling, music, dance, or reaffirmation of alliances between families and nations. These events maintained continuity across generations and strengthened collective identity. There was also deep awareness of memory and ancestry. Stories about earlier generations were not viewed only as distant history, but as active sources of instruction. The actions of ancestors, their successes, mistakes, survival strategies, and teachings continued to shape present decisions. This produced strong continuity between past and present. Knowledge accumulated over generations was treated as something valuable that required preservation and transmission. The natural world reinforced this continuity constantly. The same rivers continued flowing. The same stars returned each season. The same migration routes reappeared over time. Human life changed, but larger cycles continued. This created awareness that individuals existed within systems extending far beyond a single lifetime. And because life was understood relationally, responsibility often extended not only to the present generation, but to future generations as well. Decisions about land use, resource management, conflict, or cooperation could affect descendants many years into the future. This long-term thinking appears repeatedly in many indigenous traditions, not because the future could be predicted perfectly, but because experience showed that actions produced consequences extending across time. And as these understandings continued to shape daily life, many nations also developed highly detailed ceremonial systems connected to healing, vision, dreams, and altered states of awareness, systems that attempted not only to understand the external world, but also the inner world of thought, emotion, and perception. And so, as communities developed systems for survival, cooperation, observation, and continuity across generations, many Native American traditions also explored another dimension of experience, the inner world, the world of dreams, intuition, memory, emotion, vision, and altered states of awareness. Because for many cultures, human understanding did not come only through direct physical observation. Knowledge could also emerge through dreams, through prolonged reflection, through ceremony, or through states of deep concentration and attention. Different nations interpreted these experiences in different ways, and there was enormous variation across regions and traditions. But dreams, in particular, often carried significance beyond ordinary imagination. A dream might be understood as symbolic, as instructional, as reflective of emotional imbalance, or as a form of guidance connected to relationships with animals, ancestors, or spiritual forces. In some communities, dreams were discussed openly and interpreted carefully. Patterns, repeated images, animals, weather, or unusual events within dreams could all carry possible meaning. Not every dream was treated as important, but some were understood as requiring attention. This reflects another recurring principle, that human awareness extends beyond immediate waking activity. Sleep itself became a space where insight, fear, memory, and symbolic understanding could emerge in different forms. Dreams also reinforced the close relationship between humans and the natural world. Animals frequently appeared in dreams and stories, sometimes as protectors, teachers, warnings, or guides. Again, these meanings varied widely between traditions, but the recurring pattern remains important. Animals were not viewed solely as biological resources. They could also carry symbolic and psychological meaning. Some communities practiced forms of vision seeking, particularly during periods of transition or personal uncertainty. These practices often involved solitude, fasting, extended time in nature, or focused reflection away from ordinary social activity. The goal was not entertainment or escape, but clarity. A person might seek understanding about responsibility, purpose, identity, or direction within the community. The environment itself often became part of the process. Mountains, forests, deserts, and isolated places created conditions where attention shifted away from ordinary distraction. Long periods alone in nature can alter perception even today. Without constant noise, conversation, or structured schedules, small details become more noticeable. Wind, temperature shifts, animal sounds, changes in light, and internal thoughts become more pronounced. For many communities, these experiences could become spiritually meaningful because they disrupted ordinary patterns of perception. There were also ceremonial practices connected to healing. Illness was not always understood only as physical malfunction. Emotional imbalance, social conflict, fear, grief, or spiritual disturbance could also be understood as contributing factors. Healing practices, therefore, often addressed multiple layers at once: physical treatment, ritual, song, storytelling, group support, and symbolic action could all become part of the healing process. Different nations developed different methods and ceremonial structures. Some healing ceremonies involved music, drumming, rhythmic movement, or repeated vocal patterns. Rhythm itself can strongly affect human attention and emotional state. Repeated sound patterns can slow breathing, increase focus, and create a sense of synchronization within groups. Modern neuroscience continues to study how repetitive rhythm affects brain activity, attention, and emotional regulation. Long before scientific instruments existed, many indigenous traditions already recognized that sound, movement, and repetition could influence human experience profoundly. There was also widespread use of medicinal plants. Knowledge of plants often required decades of observation and careful transmission between generations. Certain roots reduced pain. Some leaves lowered fever. Some plants calmed the body, while others could become dangerous if used incorrectly. This knowledge was highly valuable because survival often depended on it. In many environments, there were no external medical systems to rely upon. Communities needed detailed understanding of local ecosystems and their medicinal properties. Some healers became specialists with deep expertise, developed over many years. Knowledge was often protected carefully because misuse could carry serious consequences. There were also ceremonies connected to purification and renewal. In some traditions, sweat lodges were used ceremonially. These enclosed heated spaces combined heat, darkness, water, and structured ritual in ways that produced intense physical and psychological experiences. Heat changes breathing, heart rate, attention, and bodily awareness, combined with darkness, silence, prayer, or rhythmic sound. These environments could create strong feelings of focus, release, or emotional intensity. Again, the meaning and structure of these ceremonies varied significantly between nations, but many shared an underlying goal: restoring balance, clarifying thought, strengthening connection, or preparing individuals for transition. There was also recognition that human beings could become mentally or emotionally unbalanced through fear, conflict, loss, greed, or disconnection from community. Ceremony often served to reconnect individuals to larger systems of meaning and relationship. This is important because many Native American traditions did not sharply separate the individual from the group. Isolation itself could become dangerous, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Participation in ceremony, storytelling, music, and collective ritual reinforced belonging and continuity. There was also deep awareness of altered perception produced by extreme conditions: fasting, extended isolation, exhaustion, pain, or intense environmental exposure can all affect consciousness. Many traditions approach these states carefully and within structured ceremonial contexts. The goal was generally not sensation for its own sake, but understanding, discipline, clarity, or transformation. This reflects another recurring pattern: that knowledge often required effort, patience, discipline, and controlled exposure to difficulty. Wisdom was rarely assumed to appear instantly. It developed slowly, through observation, through repetition, through challenge, and through long experience over time. And throughout all of these systems, there remains a consistent emphasis on relationship between mind and environment, between individual and community, between physical survival and emotional balance, between the visible world and the symbolic world. None of these were understood as fully separate from one another. And as these traditions continued across generations, they would eventually encounter enormous disruption through colonization, forced displacement, disease, and attempts to erase indigenous languages and cultural systems. Changes that transformed entire nations, while many traditions still struggle to survive and continue into the present day. And so, after centuries of continuity shaped by land, memory, ceremony, and oral tradition, many Native American nations encountered forces that would transform their worlds permanently. Beginning in the late 15th century and continuing over generations, European expansion into the Americas introduced massive disruption across entire continents. These changes did not occur all at once, and they affected different nations in different ways. Some communities encountered traders first, others missionaries, others military expansion, and many experienced combinations of all three over long periods of time. But across much of North America, the arrival of Europeans brought disease, warfare, forced displacement, resource competition, and profound cultural disruption. One of the most devastating factors was disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses spread into populations that had no previous exposure or immunity to them. In some regions, entire communities were severely reduced within relatively short periods of time. These losses affected not only population size, but continuity of knowledge, because oral traditions depended heavily on elders, teachers, storytellers, healers, and experienced community members. When large numbers of people died suddenly, generations of accumulated environmental, linguistic, and ceremonial knowledge could disappear with them. At the same time, European settlement increasingly altered landscapes themselves. Forests were cleared, animal populations changed, migration routes were disrupted, and rivers were transformed through expanding development. For communities whose systems of life depended on close environmental observation, these changes affected not only economics, but identity and continuity. There were also major differences in worldview regarding land ownership. Many European systems emphasized private ownership, fixed boundaries, and permanent territorial control. Many Native American traditions understood land differently. Land could be used, respected, shared, or cared for, but not always viewed as something owned permanently by individuals in the same sense. These differences often produced misunderstanding and conflict during treaty negotiations and territorial expansion. Over time, many indigenous communities were forced from ancestral lands through warfare, government policy, or coercive treaties. Entire nations were relocated across large distances into unfamiliar environments. One of the most well-known examples in United States history is the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee people and other southeastern nations were forcibly relocated westward during the 1830s. Many died during these journeys due to disease, starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. But forced relocation occurred across many regions and affected numerous nations over long periods of time. Removal from ancestral lands often disrupted food systems, seasonal knowledge, ceremonial locations, and relationships tied directly to specific environments. A people whose traditions developed around forests, coastal waters, or plains, migration patterns could suddenly find themselves placed into entirely different ecosystems. This altered daily life profoundly. There were also systematic efforts in both the United States and Canada to suppress Indigenous languages and cultural traditions. Boarding schools were established where Native children were separated from families and communities. Many were prohibited from speaking their own languages, practicing ceremonies, or maintaining traditional forms of identity. Hair was cut, clothing was changed, and names were sometimes replaced. These policies were often explicitly designed to erase Indigenous cultural continuity over generations. Because oral traditions depend heavily on language, the loss of language threatened the survival of stories, ceremonies, songs, and environmental knowledge carried within them. And yet, despite enormous pressure, many traditions survived. Languages continued to be spoken quietly within families. Ceremonies continued in protected spaces. Stories continued to be remembered, and knowledge continued to pass between generations, even under difficult conditions. This persistence reflects something important. Culture is not only preserved through institutions, it is preserved through memory, relationship, practice, and repetition. Many Native American nations adapted repeatedly to changing circumstances, while still maintaining connection to older traditions. Some combined older practices with newer technologies. Others rebuilt ceremonial systems after periods of suppression. And many communities continue today to revitalize endangered languages and preserve oral histories. There has also been increasing recognition among researchers, historians, ecologists, and scientists that Indigenous environmental knowledge often contains highly sophisticated understanding developed through long-term observation of ecosystems, controlled burning practices, water management, seasonal harvesting systems, and ecological stewardship methods used by Indigenous communities are now studied more closely than in previous generations. For example, some forest ecosystems in North America were historically managed through carefully controlled low-intensity burns. These burns reduced dangerous fuel accumulation, supported biodiversity, and helped maintain healthier forest conditions. When these practices were interrupted, certain regions became more vulnerable to severe, uncontrolled wildfire over time. This illustrates another important point, that Indigenous knowledge systems were not primitive attempts at survival. They often represented highly refined systems developed through centuries of direct environmental interaction. There has also been renewed effort in many communities to preserve traditional ecological knowledge, oral history, ceremonial practice, and language revitalization for future generations. Because language itself carries ways of seeing the world. Certain environmental relationships, spatial understandings, and cultural meanings may exist naturally within one language, but not another. When a language disappears, entire systems of memory and interpretation can disappear with it. And despite centuries of disruption, many Indigenous communities continue to maintain strong cultural identities connected to land, ancestry, ceremony, and relationship with nature. Modern Native American life is extremely diverse. Some people live in cities, others on reservations, others within traditional territories. Some traditions remain highly active publicly, while others are protected more privately within communities themselves. There is no single modern Native American experience, just as there was never a single historical Native American culture, but across many traditions, certain themes remain remarkably consistent. Respect for relationship, awareness of interdependence, attention to cycles, responsibility toward future generations, and recognition that human beings remain part of larger living systems. And as these ideas continue into the present, they also shape modern discussions about conservation, ecology, sustainability, and humanity's relationship with the natural world itself. And so, as the modern world continued to expand through industry, technology, urban growth, and large-scale resource extraction, many older ways of understanding the natural world gradually changed. In industrial societies, nature increasingly became viewed through systems of measurement, production, ownership, and efficiency. Forests became timber resources. Rivers became transportation systems or hydroelectric power sources. Animals became commercial commodities, and land became divided into property, infrastructure, and economic value. These systems allowed for enormous technological development, larger cities, faster transportation, and increased industrial production. But they also altered the relationship between humans and the environment. For much of human history, daily survival depended on direct awareness of weather, seasonal movement, water sources, soil conditions, and local ecosystems. Modern industrial systems increasingly separated many people from direct environmental dependence. Food could arrive from distant regions. Water could move through pipes. Electric light reduced awareness of seasonal darkness, and climate-controlled buildings reduced direct exposure to changing weather. As a result, many people no longer needed to observe natural systems closely in daily life. And yet, despite these changes, human beings still remain fully dependent on larger environmental systems. Air, water, soil, oceans, climate patterns, pollinators, forests, and biodiversity continue to shape the conditions necessary for human life. Over time, industrial expansion also revealed consequences: deforestation, species decline, pollution, soil depletion, overfishing, and climate instability began affecting ecosystems across the planet. These developments gradually increased interest in ecological thinking, sustainability, and long-term environmental balance. And in many discussions about ecology today, certain ideas long emphasized within Indigenous traditions have received renewed attention. The idea that humans are participants within ecosystems rather than separate from them. the understanding that actions can produce consequences extending across generations, and the recognition that imbalance within one part of a system can eventually affect the whole system itself. Modern ecology now studies many forms of interdependence scientifically: how forests influence rainfall, how predators regulate ecosystems, how soil organisms affect plant growth, how ocean temperatures influence weather patterns across continents. The natural world increasingly appears not as isolated pieces, but as networks of connected systems affecting one another continuously. In some ways, this scientific understanding echoes patterns long recognized through direct observation by many indigenous cultures, not because the systems are identical, but because both emphasize relationship, interaction, and interdependence. There has also been growing recognition of traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes referred to as TEK. This term is used to describe environmental knowledge developed through long-term interaction between communities and ecosystems over many generations. Traditional ecological knowledge often includes detailed understanding of local plants, animal behavior, seasonal timing, fire management, water systems, and sustainable harvesting patterns. In some regions, scientists and indigenous communities now collaborate in wildlife management, forest restoration, and conservation planning, because knowledge developed through centuries of direct environmental observation can contain information not always visible through short-term scientific study alone. There has also been renewed interest in controlled burning practices historically used by indigenous communities in parts of North America for thousands of years. Many communities intentionally used low-intensity fire to maintain healthier ecosystems. These burns reduced dangerous fuel buildup, encouraged growth of certain plants, supported animal habitats, and lowered the likelihood of catastrophic wildfire. When many of these practices were suppressed during colonization, fuel accumulation increased across some regions over long periods of time. Today, some land management systems are once again incorporating controlled burns informed partly by indigenous knowledge. This reflects a broader shift toward recognizing that older environmental systems often contained practical sophistication developed through long-term adaptation. There has also been increasing awareness of psychological effects associated with separation from nature. Modern research suggests that regular exposure to natural environments can influence stress levels, attention, sleep quality, emotional regulation, and overall mental health. Spending time near water, in forests, or under open skies often affects breathing patterns, heart rate, and nervous system activity. Humans evolved within natural environments for most of history, and many aspects of the brain still respond strongly to natural sensory patterns. Wind moving through trees, flowing water, birdsong, firelight, and gradual environmental rhythms often create calming effects because they are relatively non-threatening and predictable forms of sensory input. Artificial environments, constant noise, bright screens, and rapid information flow can produce very different patterns of stimulation. As a result, many people in modern societies increasingly seek reconnection with nature through hiking, camping, gardening, national parks, or intentional time away from technology. This does not mean returning fully to older ways of life, but it reflects recognition that human beings still respond deeply to natural environments. There is also growing awareness that sustainability requires long-term thinking. Many environmental systems change slowly, sometimes across decades or centuries. Forests may take generations to recover. Species decline gradually before becoming visible, and climate patterns can shift over long periods before major consequences emerge. This makes long-term observation increasingly important, and here again, many Indigenous traditions emphasized awareness across generations. The understanding that actions taken today could affect descendants far into the future. This perspective encourages caution towards systems that produce immediate benefit while creating long-term instability. It also encourages humility, because despite technological advancement, human beings still remain dependent on systems far larger than themselves. The atmosphere, oceans, fresh water, soil fertility, and biodiversity cannot be replaced easily once damaged. And across all of these discussions, one recurring idea continues to appear: that relationship with nature is not optional. Only the awareness of that relationship changes. Whether recognized or ignored, humans remain connected to larger ecological systems continuously. The air entering the lungs, the water moving through rivers, the changing climate, the migration of animals, the growth of forests, and the movement of seasons all continue regardless of human opinion. And perhaps this is one reason many Indigenous traditions continue to resonate with people today. Not because they belong only to the past, but because they address questions that remain deeply relevant in the present. Questions about balance, responsibility, relationship, attention, and humanity's place within the living world itself. And as these ideas settle quietly into the background, the larger patterns begin to feel less distant. The cycles of weather, the movement of stars, the return of seasons, and the rhythms of life continuing slowly across time, patterns that existed long before modern civilization, and that will likely continue long after any individual lifetime has passed. And so, after moving through these landscapes, these stories, these traditions, and these ways of understanding the natural world, a quieter pattern begins to emerge. Not a single belief or a single explanation, but a recurring way of seeing, a recognition that humans are not separate from the world around them, but participants within it, connected to the movement of water, to changing seasons, to animals, to weather, to memory, and to time itself. Across many Native American traditions, nature was not viewed as empty background scenery. The land carried history. The sky carried meaning. And the rhythms of the world became teachers observed patiently across generations. These understandings developed slowly through direct experience, through survival, through storytelling, and through careful attention to repeating patterns. The return of spring, the movement of stars, the migration of animals, the approach of winter, cycles continuing again and again across long stretches of time. And even now, many of those same patterns continue quietly outside. Rivers still move toward the ocean. Forests continue growing toward light. The moon still changes shape across the night sky, and seasons continue their gradual return. Human societies change rapidly. Technology changes rapidly, but many larger rhythms of the world continue at their own pace. Perhaps this is part of what made nature so important within many Indigenous traditions, not only because it provided food, water, or shelter, but because it offered continuity, something older than any individual life, something steady enough to observe across generations. And as attention begins to soften now, there is less need to follow every idea, less need to organize every detail. The forests, the rivers, the open plains, The desert skies and the stars above them can simply remain where they are, quietly continuing without requiring anything more. The movement of wind through trees, the sound of water, the slow appearance of stars after sunset, patterns that have repeated for thousands of years. And somewhere beneath all modern noise, those same rhythms still exist, steady, ancient, and ongoing, allowing the mind to slow with them, allowing thought to soften gradually, allowing attention to drift further and further from effort, until there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to solve, nothing left to hold on to, only darkness, stillness, and the quiet movement of the world continuing softly through the night.